What do you think of the odds that a wealthy aristocrat like Joseph of Arimathea would own a tomb, not on his property, but near a crucifixion site for Roman criminals? That seems extremely unlikely.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. You're in for a good one today. This one is a faith versus skepticism showdown over the single most important claim in Christianity. Did Jesus actually rise bodily from the dead? On one side, you've got Trent, defending the resurrection and the classic case that the apostles suffered for what they witnessed. On the other side, Alex picks the whole thing apart piece by piece, going after Paul's vision, the earliest martyr stories, and the strange details surrounding that famous empty tomb. It gets sharp, it gets technical, and it gets genuinely fascinating. Stick around all the way through, because the strongest point of the entire exchange lands near the back half, and you do not want to miss how calmly it gets delivered. Also, I'm always curious who's tuning in, so drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far this channel reaches. All right, let's get into it.
I find it really important when people talk about like the persecution of the apostles. You kind of get this merging between like people like Peter and people like Paul. You know, like earlier you were talking about how the persecution of the apostles is clear. If you look at Paul's letters, he talks very clearly about the persecutions he underwent. Certainly so. But remember what Paul saw. Remember the nature of Paul's experience. It's a flash of light. Paul did not meet the bodily resurrected Jesus, and that's the claim that we're discussing, whether Jesus bodily resurrected from the dead. I don't want to say admit, you just assert as well as anyone else could that people can happily die for things that they think are true, but didn't see themselves. The whole point is that they need to have seen it themselves, and Paul did not see a bodily resurrected Jesus. Who's the earliest martyr? Who's the earliest Christian martyr?
Probably James. Well, Stephen would be the first martyr, and then James's description in Acts chapter 12.
It's Stephen, okay? And what is Stephen martyred for? Having a vision in the sky. He looks up and he sees Jesus stood or sat at the right hand of the Father, and he's stoned to death for it. The earliest martyrdom story we have is of a vision. The most obvious persecution that we have firsthand is that of Paul, whose experience was that of a vision. The idea of the physical resurrection of Jesus, even if we agree that Peter was persecuted, we don't know what it is that Peter saw. Yeah, we have some like second, third-hand accounts from the Gospels. That's if you believe the traditional authorship. But that's not the same thing as saying that that we know for a fact that an eyewitness to a specific event was persecuted for belief in that event. Even with James, we don't know why he was put to death. Surely, the most plausible conclusion is that he was preaching Christianity. Herod says that this was pleasing to the Jews when he kills James, but we just don't know the details. At least not strongly enough for me to believe in a miracle.
Josephus says that he was stoned to death for being a lawbreaker, and he's specifically referenced in Josephus as the brother of Christ, the one who is called Christ.
Yes, I understand that, but we just don't know the details of the reasons behind the martyrdom of this apostle, I think. Although, look, this is maybe a question for Sean McDowell. I just want to say that on the point of persecution, we need to be very careful about who we're talking about and keep it separate. Let's not say, look, we know that the apostles were persecuted because look at the letters of Paul. And we know that Paul was persecuted.
But it's not just that. We also have the testimony in the book of Acts, and we also have Tacitus talking about the Neronian persecution.
But then that's not firsthand. Right, you understand what I'm saying? Is that
it doesn't necessarily have to be firsthand, because I think there's good evidence that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul and that he's a good historian.
Is that because of the we passages?
You have to understand why this opening exchange matters so much, because it goes straight at the single argument Apologetics leans on the hardest. The apostles died for what they saw, so it must be true. Line gets repeated like it's a checkmate, and Alex just calmly takes the air out of it. He points out that Paul's experience was a flash of light. Paul did not meet the bodily resurrected Jesus. And that is the entire ballgame, because the claim on the table is a physical bodily resurrection, not a glowing vision on a road. Here's the part that blows my mind. Alex makes the point that people will happily die for things they believe are true, but never actually saw themselves. He says the whole point is that they need to have seen it themselves. Think about how devastating that is. Every cause in history has martyrs. People die for sincerely held beliefs constantly. Sincerity proves you believe something. It does not prove the thing is real. That distinction should be obvious. But it gets buried under emotional storytelling. And then watch what happens with Stephen. Trent names Stephen as the earliest martyr, and when Alex asks what Stephen was actually killed for, Trent says it himself, having a vision in the sky. He looks up, sees Jesus at the right hand of the Father, and gets stoned for it. So the earliest martyrdom on record is, by the apologist's own description, a vision. Not an encounter with a walking, talking, resurrected body. He handed Alex the point. Then Alex closes the loop on Peter and James. He says we have some second and third hand accounts from the Gospels, and that's not the same as knowing for a fact that an eyewitness to a specific event was persecuted for belief in that event. That's the gap nobody wants to admit exists. We don't have Peter telling us what he saw. We have stories about stories.
Yeah, I think that's one element to it. And I've read the critiques of people trying to say that's some kind of seagoing narrative motif. And I think there's very
I wasn't going to go down that route.
That.
I was just going to say that, do you therefore reject the traditional authorship of John's Gospel? Because near the end of John's Gospel, in John chapter 20, the beloved disciple is referred to seeing something, and the author of John's Gospel says, and we know that his testimony is true. And given that we passages mean that it's speaking in the first person, that means that John was not authored by the beloved disciple, right?
It is possible that John was authored by someone else, like John the Presbyter, that was part of the Johannine community. So I do think it provides other evidence. I don't think it's as strong as Luke, for example. But that's why, as I said before, I think that you don't want to take a dogmatic view when you're making a historical case.
Yes.
You're going to weigh things a little bit. So
it's important because, I mean, John asked about the empty tomb, which I didn't have a chance to speak about. I wanted to, I mean, a moment ago you said that, look, it's important to ask, what would you expect if it were true? And I agree with you. The data fits with what would happen if it were true. What I'm saying is it also fits with what would happen if it were not true. And in that position as an agnostic, I'm not going to believe in the resurrection, right? It might not be enough for a Christian to abandon faith.
Okay.
But I believe it. I believe it does because I think there are other explanations. For example, looking at the empty tomb. This is really important, right? The empty tomb is like a key point here. Like, okay, I don't know if there was an empty tomb. I mean, I think just like prima facie, I have some suspicion that a member of the Sanhedrin could just like ask Pilate to take the body off the cross and like keep it for himself, when typically Romans would leave bodies on the cross as evidence of crucifixion. Maybe because it was a Jewish holiday. I mean, they say it's because of the Jewish holiday they take them down from the cross, as if Pilate cares about Jewish holidays. Maybe he does because he doesn't want to like incite a riot or something. Maybe. I'm not entirely sure. But let's just say that there were some kind of tomb. What's the nature of this tomb? We're told it's Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, only in Matthew's Gospel. John's Gospel seems to imply that it's specifically not Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. In fact, in John chapter 19, verse 38, it's Joseph and Nicodemus who are taking the body of Jesus, and it says, at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, this is the day before the Sabbath, so they had to solve this problem before the Sabbath began, that is, before Friday night. And there's this tomb that happens to be nearby.
Now Trent tries to rebuild the foundation, and you can feel him reaching. He argues it doesn't have to be firsthand, because there's good evidence Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. And look, that's a real scholarly position, I'll give him that. But notice what just happened. We started at, the apostles died for what they witnessed, and we've quietly slid all the way down to, well, a companion of one guy might have been a decent historian. That is a massive downgrade in the strength of the claim, and it happened in real time. This is the part people don't realize. Alex isn't even being aggressive here. He makes one of the most honest statements in the entire debate. He says the data fits with what would happen if it were true, but it also fits with what would happen if it were not true. That's it. That's the whole skeptical position in one sentence. When evidence is equally consistent with two opposite explanations, it can't be used to prove either one. A believer can keep believing, but nobody is obligated to. And then he does something I really respect. He says plainly, I don't know if there was an empty tomb. He's not claiming certainty. He's not pretending to have all the answers. He's just refusing to accept the most extraordinary explanation possible when ordinary ones are sitting right there. Then he sets the trap on the tomb itself. He points out we're told it's Joseph of Arimathea's tomb only in Matthew's Gospel, and that John's Gospel seems to imply it's specifically not Joseph's tomb. That's a genuine tension inside the texts themselves. The accounts don't agree on a detail this basic, and that matters when the entire resurrection case depends on the tomb being real, identifiable, and verifiably empty.
What do you think of the odds that a wealthy aristocrat like Joseph of Arimathea would own a tomb, not on his property, but near a crucifixion site for Roman criminals? That seems extremely unlikely. What's more likely is what John tells us, which is that there was a tomb nearby.
Tombs would be outside the city. It's an unclean site, and that's exactly what we find when we do archaeological investigations of Jerusalem. And you would have people executed outside of the city, outside of the gates.
I think what John is telling, but in terms of where you would put the remains, I think if Joseph owns a tomb, it's unlikely to be near this site of crucifixion. And in fact, I think John's Gospel is telling us that by saying that it's because it's the day of Jewish preparation. It doesn't. If this was just Joseph's tomb, why would it be because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they put Jesus there? It seems to me that this is like an emergency burial in time for the Sabbath. When does the Sabbath end? It ends on Saturday night. So then, the burial party come to this emergency tomb, take the body of Jesus, and give it a proper burial. Early that morning, when it's still dark, so a few hours later, Mary comes along, sees an empty tomb, sees that the stone has already been rolled away, and says what? She assumes that the body has been taken. So there are two hypotheses here. One is that it's stolen. Some people think the body is stolen. We have good evidence for the stealing of bodies in the ancient world. You'll know about the Nazareth inscription, a 1st century Greek sort of legal inscription from an unknown Roman emperor, which issues the death penalty for people who steal bodies and tamper with tombs. So we know that in the ancient world people were stealing bodies. We also have epitaphs on Jewish graves cursing people who steal bodies. We know that the stealing of bodies was something done popularly enough that they had to warn against it. We also know, of course, about the polemic in Matthew's Gospel, which specifically says that there is a rumor that Jesus' body has been stolen. People are obviously believing this even by the time of the writing of Matthew's Gospel. But it doesn't have to be. And you ask, well, who would steal it? One of the reasons people stole bodies was for use in like magical incantations, like magicians and the like. And of course, they specifically wanted people who'd undergone violent deaths, and the idea of a holy man who'd undergone a violent death would just be too tempting to give up. But even if you don't want to believe that, there's also the fact that the burial party of Jesus is said in John's Gospel to have given him emergency burial right nearby the place because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and it's after the Sabbath that the tomb is now empty, and Mary Magdalene sees the tomb, and her first thought is that they've taken the Lord, and we do not know where they have put him. Like, I'm not going to say that the body was taken. I don't even know if there was an empty tomb, but if there were, the idea that it was taken either by a grave robber or by the burial party of Joseph of Arimathea is exceptionally more likely to me than that Jesus rose from the dead. Again, I won't say it didn't happen. I just want to say that that's a skeptical scenario, which seems to me perfectly plausible, since you asked about the empty tomb.
Trent, can I just give you a few minutes to respond to those claims about the empty tomb?
This is the moment everything tightens. Alex asks what the odds are that a wealthy aristocrat like Joseph of Arimathea would own a tomb, not on his own property, but right next to a crucifixion site for Roman criminals. And then he just says it. That seems extremely unlikely. And honestly, it does. Rich people don't build their family tombs in the execution district. That's not where you put your ancestors. The question alone exposes how much of the story we just accept without ever stopping to ask if it makes any practical sense. His alternative is so clean. He suggests this was an emergency burial in time for the Sabbath. A body needed to go somewhere fast before sundown, the nearest available tomb got used, and that's why it's described as a temporary rushed arrangement. No miracle required. Just Jewish burial law and a ticking clock. And here's where Alex does something genuinely educational, because he brings in the Nazareth inscription. For anyone who hasn't heard of it, this is a 1st century Greek legal inscription ordering the death penalty for people who steal bodies and tamper with tombs. Sit with that for a second. The penalty for grave robbing was death. You don't write a law that severe unless body theft was a real recurring problem in the ancient world. That's documented history, and it tells you an empty tomb wouldn't have shocked anyone back then the way modern apologetics frames it. So Alex lands the closing blow, and it's measured, which makes it hit harder. He says the idea that the body was taken, either by a grave robber or by the burial party itself, is exceptionally more likely to him than that Jesus rose from the dead. He's not screaming that it's impossible. He's just weighing two explanations like a reasonable person, and noticing one of them requires breaking the laws of nature, and the other requires a guy moving a body. That's not arrogance. That's just keeping your feet on the ground. And that's what I love about this whole exchange. Alex never has to raise his voice. He just keeps asking the simple, grounded questions, and the extraordinary version of the story keeps getting less and less necessary. When the natural explanation does all the work the miracle was supposed to do, the miracle becomes optional. And once it's optional, the burden never gets met. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.